everybody, and welcome to Live from the Heartland for the week of January 20th in the great year 2024. We are recording this on Martin Luther King Day, January 15th. We are in the heart of Rogers Park in Chicago, and I am Michael James, your host for today's show. Our guest today will be the former alderman, longtime professor, keen-eyed fellow regarding politics in Chicago, the one and only Dick Simpson. And then we're bringing back another old friend, Warren Leming, used to be involved with a band called Wilderness Road and a lot of other things since then. And we're going to talk the American underground and bohemian culture, what it used to be and what's lacking today. So a couple of good things. One of the things happened late last night. Again, we're recording on the 15th. Was that Bernardo Arevalo is now the new president of Guatemala. And you political folks with keen memories remember that in 1956, the United States helped to overthrow a fellow named Arbenz, who was a progressive and popular leader. And ever since then, there have been a succession of pretty conservative right-wing folks in Guatemala, and this is a big change. There's a lot of attempts to keep him from carrying out his pledges, but we shall see. And the U.S. has gotten better on that and actually helped to make sure that the election wasn't messed up more than they attempted to do. This also being Martin Luther King Day, when we are recording this show, I thought I'd share a couple of memories. King's speech, I have a dream, that kind of thing, always has gotten to me. A lot of tears over the years swell up. I first saw Dr. King in the summer of 1966 when I was working in Uptown with Joint Community Union, and we went to a rally at Soldier Field. And I remember him driving in a convertible along with then Senator Paul Douglas. A few years later, in 1963, I went to the March on Washington, and I found something I wrote in the Rag blog about that. I was going to school in Connecticut up at Trinity, taking a Spanish class, and myself and two other fellows took a ride in a little green, I call it a critter, but it was a Volkswagen. So I'm going to quote myself here. The morning of August 23rd, 1963, we were moving, first in the little green critter of a car surrounded by busloads of people on the Freedom Road. Then we walked, marching, surrounded by a mass of humanity. And then thousands upon thousands of us stood together as one at the Lincoln Memorial and Reflecting Pool. We felt a real sense of hope and togetherness, a belief in the future. To this day, I welcome the tears that come often when I hear Dr. King as he declares, "I have a dream. We shall overcome someday, black and white together. That day is good forever." I also got to meet Dr. King briefly in a West Side apartment with Rennie Davis back in the summer of 66, I believe. And then I had the honor of being a speaker at a peace march on March 25th, 1967 at the Coliseum, along with Dr. King, Emil Mazie from the United Auto Workers, and Dr. Spock. So, all these memories came up as I realized what day it was, and it is a holiday here now. And we are now recording on Monday, so it was the perfect time to share some of those thoughts. I want to add one other thing that I got in an email, Frederick Joseph at Substack.com. That's Frederick Joseph. And he has a piece that I got in the mail today, and he is an author, a best-selling New York Times author. He says, now heralded as a symbol of peace and racial harmony, Dr. King was, in the context of his time, a figure of immense controversy, a radical whose vision for America challenged the very foundations of his societal structures. This is an article called "The Co-opting of a Radical, the Deliberate Distortion of Dr. Martin Luther King's Legacy." Again, Frederick Joseph at Substack.com if you want to read the whole thing. It's very good. Okay, that's enough chatter for the opening of the show. We're going to have a little musical break brought to us by our engineer, Hal James, and then we'll be back with Dick Simpson, and we're going to talk about a new book that he has that basically is about Chicago's modern mayors, from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot. Be right back. Welcome back, you citizens of the world. And now Here on Live from the Heartland for the week of January 20th, we bring on the one and only Dick Simpson. He was an alderman way back. He's a longtime professor at University of Illinois, Chicago, and an author. And what caught my attention this time, and he's been on the show a number of times, was a panel put together that included a number of people talking about basically Chicago's modern mayors from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot. The book is edited by both Dick Simpson and Betty O'Shaughnessy, and they recently had a panel at the Chicago Library, the Harold Washington Library, on this past Tuesday, January 29th. I had hoped to go, but I get lazy later in the evening, so I got you in person, well, so to speak, resuming it. Good afternoon to you, Dick, or good morning, whatever time it is when people are watching the show.
Good morning and afternoon to you.
So tell us a little bit about the book. How did you pick the folks on the panel? What led to you doing this most recent book and this event?
So we were setting up some panels at UIC before I retired, and we had in various scholars, journalists, sociologists, political scientists to talk about the different mayors and to try and figure out what happened and what Chicago's political history was like, because it's very easy for us to break up our history in terms of mayoral eras. We all remember like the Harold Washington era or the Lori Lightfoot era. So that made it a very compact way and a very compelling way to tell the story of modern Chicago politics.
And how did the event turn out, and who was on the panel?
So we had different authors for different mayors. The ones who were actually present for the panel were Betty O'Shaughnessy and myself, Carrie Lighterson and Daniel Bliss, who was at IIT. And we had Monroe Anderson, who was the press secretary for Mayor Sawyer. And I was reading the comments also from Dennis Judd, who was a former head of the department at UIC and is now retired in St. Louis. We had two authors who weren't there from Washington, D.C., who did the Harold Washington chapter. It was a grand adventure looking back at Chicago history and trying to make sense out of it. And these authors all have very special insights. They don't agree. They're all doing different mayors and doing different points of view and different ways to approach the topic.
Was Carrie Lighterson actually on the site?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know she was back in town. And
yeah, she is.
Daniel Bliss is not Daniel Biss, the mayor of Evanston.
There is some confusion about that. We would have been glad to have Daniel Biss as well, but Daniel Bliss is one of my former students who got his PhD and is now associate professor down at IIT.
Well, Daniel Biss is busy dealing with the blowback around creating a new stadium up in Evanston. And if people listen to or watch last week's Live from the Heartland, we had both Jim Knadel, a former track coach at Northwestern, as well as the activist Jeff Smith, talking about all those things, including the mayor there. But back to Chicago's mayors, what was the highlight of it? Who impressed you the most? Who won your heart? Who changed your mind on anything? Anything like that come to mind?
I think that's true of all of the mayors. I think we uncovered a new way of looking at each of them. But the book has an arc to it, or the history has an arc, and the book records that arc. It runs from Harold Washington and to Lori Lightfoot, bookending the progressive eras of modern Chicago history, which is being carried on by Brandon Johnson. But it has in between, there are really two kinds of mayors, the progressive reform mayors, and then there are what might be called the establishment builder mayors. Think, for instance, of Richard M. Daley building up the lakefront, putting those fences around the parks and the schools, beautifying Chicago, making us at least presiding over when we became a global city. So builder in that sense, like his father was. Now, I fought with his father every year of his life that I was at least around in Chicago. So I don't mean to say that we always agree with what they built or how they neglected the neighborhoods to build it or the racism that's existed in Chicago. But it's important to recognize the contributions and the failings of each of the mayors. And that's what we tried to achieve.
Well, let's go through these mayors one by one. Let's start with our favorite, probably yours too, but I'm not sure. Harold Washington. What did the panel have to say about Harold and his short reign here in Chicago?
Well, for each mayor, we asked essentially all the authors to work on 4 questions. How did they get elected? What was their relationship with the city council and also the various groups like the labor and business communities and the local neighborhoods? Then what were their big challenges? What was the crisis in their administration or the challenges and how did they rise to it? And then finally, what is their legacy? To go through that with Harold very quickly, Harold, as you know, got elected with 36% of the vote in the primary. He did not get 51%. He only got 52% in the general election. He was a real challenge to the establishment. You had 2 white people running against 1 black man, and he had the combined forces of the old and new machine trying to beat off the progressive reform of which you and your colleagues up at the Heartland were very much a part of. This was really an incredible election. We remember some of the key events like out on the northwest side of Chicago when even Vice President Mondale was jeered and when there was real fear that maybe Harold would be killed in the process. Very angry mobs at some of the churches and other events on the northwest side. But Harold prevailed. And his biggest challenge was probably the challenge with the city council. He also had the challenge with Reaganomics. He was dealing with 2 different problems. One, he didn't have the votes in the city council. There was a 29-21 split, the so-called council wars. And at the same time, Ronald Reagan was president. And Harold had led in Congress the protests against Reaganomics. And he continued, even as mayor, to have to fight a lack of money from Washington and a lack of support in the city council. He did have this strong support of the neighborhoods. He was able to rally all of the community, many of the community organizations in Chicago. And through their combined efforts, they finally overcame with a court case, the gerrymandering, and Harold got a majority in the council, but he only lived 7 months after that happened. Interestingly enough, the split in the city council went from 29 to 21 to 40-10. There is an automatic transfer whenever the mayor gets the full power, the aldermen bend their knee.
Well, we loved Harold, and we're real sorry that he didn't live longer. I remember when he came to the Heartland, he was there for a great rally, but he was also there on another occasion, and he ate the catfish, but not the vegetables and not the cornbread.
Yeah, and that was his undoing eventually, unfortunately. He
Well,
needed those vegetables.
Some people thought that he'd been knocked off. Do you have any credence with that? Is there anything to
No,
that?
it's not true. He died of a stroke because of, or you can think of it as a heart attack. His heart was 3 or 4 times the size of most people's hearts. And that was really true of Harold himself. He was very outgoing, besides being a wonderful wordsmith and a wonderful speaker. He really did care about people and paid attention to people and their needs.
Yeah, I still think that he deserves a lot more attention than he's gotten even on the national stage. But that'll come, I'm sure, over time. Let's go on to our next mayor. Who was our next mayor after that?
So it was Eugene Sawyer. He got elected, obviously, in that controversial all-night meeting at the city hall when the aldermen voted him in.
I remember that meeting.
Yeah, very chaotic.
Trying to stop it.
Yeah. There are a number of things about Sawyer that really most people don't remember. First of all, although he got elected by the white aldermen, the old 29 who were opposed to Harold, he managed his program was the Harold Washington program. the things he carried forward were the Harold Washington agenda, and many of the people in the cabinet and in City Hall were still Harold Washington supporters. And that's usually not recognized. One thing that is pretty well known but not thought about, he had the most divided city council maybe in the history of Chicago, and I've studied many of them, but certainly in the last 50 years. And because it wasn't a rubber stamp, it was almost anarchy. There were 187 divided roll call votes in a single year. That they couldn't agree that whether the sun came up this morning. Well, some Chicagoans looking outside might have a doubt about that too. But it was that divided. It was chaotic. But he got through important legislation that moved the city forward. He was defeated. Each of the mayors, one of the findings in the book is, of course, whites are no longer the dominant only race in Chicago and controlling all affairs. To be mayor, you had to have the support of a couple of parts of the racial coalitions in the city. And Sawyer couldn't get a unified black support and couldn't get the progressive support. So he lost badly in the election. He's an underappreciated figure. He had many flaws, but he was better than most people understood. We go forward to Richard M. Daley, another 22-year mayor. Richard M. Daley did a number of things. He did calm the racial tensions in Chicago, which were still going on in the city council during the Sawyer reign. They were becoming explicit again. He was a builder, establishment mayor. The negative side, I've already talked a little bit about the lakefront and the other things he did, but the downside was that there was corruption. He re-erected the machine, this time plugging in the rich global economy, the people who benefited from the global economy, the lawyers, the bankers, the traders, and the others. And that allowed him to have complete power. He used patronage. The Sorich decision showed that he had 5,000 patronage workers, but they weren't through the regular ward organizations. The ward committeemen and others had often broken with him and tried to put him down after his father's death. So he created his own patronage army. His greatest downfall was that he sold off the city assets as one-time financial benefits to be able to balance the budget without increasing the property taxes. And that created many of the problems. Most people remember the selling of the Skyway, but much worse was the selling of the parking meters. And then we go on to Rahm Emanuel, who's sort of Daley on steroids. Rahm Emanuel raised $32 million to run for mayor. Daley had created the idea of running a presidential style campaign for mayor with people like David Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel on his staff. But Emanuel was able to buy big ads to really push through. He no longer had a patronage army, but he had so much money that it didn't matter that he didn't have a patronage army or didn't have much of a patronage army left. He did, like Daley, do a lot of building. He completed the Daley program in a way. A lot of parts of Millennium Park, a lot of the redoing of Navy Pier actually happened during the Rahm Emanuel era. But it was still downtown. It was still trying to attract the new tech industries and be part of the global economy. All of those things were pretty positive, but the downside was the neighborhoods were harmed. Many of your listeners, viewers will know about the book Mayor 1% by Carrie. She continues that theme a bit in this analysis, in this book, closing mental health centers, the closing of 50 public schools, and so forth during the Emanuel era. And then we get to Lori Lightfoot. Lori Lightfoot, I think, has also been underappreciated. And I'll just cover a few things. First of all, Lori's election was sort of a near miracle. At the time, Rahm Emanuel dropped out of the race roughly Labor Day. He had 31% support. It was clear he was going to have a hard time being elected mayor. but all of his opponents, the strongest, had 16%. And Lori Lightfoot had only 2 or 3% support when it started. She was outraised. Bill Daley raised $9 million. Tony Preckwinkle raised $5 million. Lori raised $1.5 million, but that was enough. And mainly she got elected on a reform platform. And there were 2 parts to her coalition, a good government reform part of the coalition and a progressive part of the coalition. She delivered better to the good government coalition, but she did very progressive and important things, such as the South Invest Southwest program. She also confronted COVID and saved thousands and thousands of lives because we did right with COVID, whereas we're having such a great struggle today with the immigration problem under Brandon Johnson. I could go on any of these, but I'll follow your questions.
Well, first of all, there's a couple of mayors in there that are, well, I'm going to bring it up to our current mayor, Brandon Johnson. I mean, I would say that Lori kind of had a progressive base of support. The new mayor Johnson does, and certainly Harold did. And I'm just a little wondering what your take is. How does Chicago end up, being this hard ass city that we, with the machine and all that, how we ended up coming up with these progressive mayors? Is there something in the DNA of our populace that's leading us in a progressive direction?
Well, one thing is we've had a historic struggle for over 100 years between machine and reform. The political machine was first created in 1871 after the Chicago fire. The reform movement has existed all along. It hasn't always been the same reforms. So the earlier progressives, as they were called, were really good government reformers, not necessarily social progressives. And we built up with Saul Alinsky, with Jane Addams, with thousands of others who've contributed. We've managed to change the direction of the city. And partly it's because of the problems we've confronted over the years. We have to be a modern city, and the modern city is more progressive than the old city.
Well, we're going to run out of time, which we always do in the show when these interviews get going. But why don't you talk a little bit about, off the cuff if you want, or I mean, you may have it written down, our current mayor, Mayor Johnson. I know he's come in with a lot of challenges. He certainly turned out the vote. He surprised a lot of people. We're rooting for him. I think it's been a little rocky, but it was rocky for Harold early on. Any take on Johnson and going forward?
Well, I think we have to give Johnson some time. You're right that Harold had a good administration and good people, good ideas, but because of council wars, wasn't able to implement them for some time. So Brandon Johnson has got a different problem. He's been a little slow to appoint the commissioners and the key members of the cabinet. He has fumbled he hasn't had a plan like Lori Lightfoot and her health commissioner had a plan for dealing with COVID. Brandon has sort of been flying by the seat of his pants on the immigration issue. But nonetheless, Brandon has passed important legislation. In fact, he has not lost a vote in the city council. He has 30 aldermen who've supported him. They're not the same 30 aldermen every time. This isn't rock solid, but he does have support. The only issue on which there was almost a lost vote was a censure of his floor leader at the time. And that really wasn't Brandon's fault, and it wasn't really a Brandon or an ideological issue.
What do you got to say in about 2 minutes that we have left about the future of our city and our government? We do have a good number of avowed socialist types now in the city council. There's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of good ideas going on. What's your take?
Well, I'm always positive about the future of Chicago, but it's always a struggle and always our choice. If we don't fight for it, we won't get it. And so it's important to keep alive the progressive movement and the reform movement and to move the city forward. And the people need to be empowered. We've failed to provide neighborhood government. We failed to give the power to the people, and that's still participatory democracy is the way forward, and we're not there yet.
I like your worldview there. And I want to thank you very much, Dick Simpson, for coming on. And I'm inviting you back right now, maybe in another month, because we got more to talk about. People should get this newly released book, Chicago's Modern Mayors, from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot, edited by not only Dick Simpson, but also Betty O'Shaughnessy. Anything else you want to add as we go out, Dick?
No, keep the faith and keep working. We're moving in the right direction.
All right, all power to the people. We'll be right back with more Live from the Heartland. We're going to delve deep into Bohemia with Warren Leming in our second segment. You're here on the left end of the dial, and wherever you're getting the show, we're glad you're here. And we'll be right back with a little bit more for this week of January 20th. We're going to talk for the next period of time on the show about beatniks, bohemians, the underground, what happened in the old days, what's going on now. And we were doing this all with our friend Warren Leming. Some of you may have known Warren from the band Wilderness Road or some of the plays that he's done, but he's a wonderful fellow, a good man, and knows a lot of things that he's going to share with us here on Live from the Heartland. Hey, Warren, how you doing?
Hey, good, Michael. Good to see you. Glad things are going well. I hope everybody out there is staying warm, because we're going to be knocking out those hits and those hypes and those heavies today. But say, hey, don't go away. We've got the DJ here, Michael, working on it. We're going to get down and tromp around and make some shit happen. Okay?
And we're ooh-diddy-wop, and we're back on the scene with the word-making machine. Anyhow, we were talking the other day, last time you were on the show, and we ended up, you were kind of talking about beatniks and bohemians and the politics of that and how that seems to be missing. So I thought it'd be great if you wanted to share some of your thoughts, memories, inspirational.
I mean, that it's like we're all formed by something or other. And for me, it was going down as a young high school kid to the corner of Chestnut and State in Chicago. Now, if you go down there now, it's gentrified. It's gigantic high rises and whatnot. In my day, and this we're talking the 50s in Chicago, it was a home to the Dill Pickle Club, the College of Complexes with Slim Brundage, famous figure, and Maury's Cafe, which was a beatnik cafe, and the Pad, which was another place where people went to have a few libations and a little more. And it was a wonderful spot, and it speaks to Chicago's old bohemian situation in the 20s and the 30s, because of the IWW, the famous IWW, Workers of the World. That was going on in Chicago. You had Sherwood Anderson here, the writer. You had Theodore Dreiser. You had Maxwell Bodenheim. You had a famous bohemian scene. You had Emma Goldman, the radical herself, who was rousted out of the country by the FBI, and just a whole famous segment of Bohemia going on here in Chicago. But Chicago was the center of a kind of Bohemia. And that brings us to the next topic, which is a book that's coming out through Kerr Publishing. It's being re-released, called Hobo Bohemia. Okay, and it used to have an introduction to it, still has an introduction to it, by my old friend Franklin Rosemont, who I met in Proviso High School years and years and years ago. And he had a little thing called the Lantern, which is a mimeographed sheet. And some friends of mine, Alex Gadash, myself, and some other people wrote for it. We did radical poetry and whatnot, and we were accused by one of the faculty of being communists. So we were called into the dean's office, and we were summarily going to be kicked out of school. But somebody who was a progressive on the faculty got wind of this and actually stepped in and saved us and said, I know these kids, they're decent, God-fearing Christians. Don't chuck them into the snow. So we were saved in that sense, but that'll give you some idea of the kind of hysteria that was going on in the country in the 50s. But more to the point, Chicago was a center in the 20s and the 30s, and even before, of a huge radical bohemian community. There was a thing called the Anarchist Picnic in Chicago, and this was before the turn of the century, and it annually drew 40,000 people. Okay, if you can imagine that. And of course, Chicago was famous because in 1886 you had the Haymarket incident, which led to the hanging of 4 men and the imprisonment of 3 others. And then Altgeld, who was later the governor, pardoned them and had his career destroyed because he had pardoned these fellows who had been in charge. Their crime was advocating an 8-hour day and the union movement. And that got them in such terrible trouble that 4 of them were hung, and they packed the court. And it was a pretty awful situation. But Chicago was the site of the most famous, I'd say the most famous class incident of the 19th century. That
You know,
happened.
Altgeld, some people might not know,
Yeah.
but there is Altgeld Street in Chicago, named after
Right,
that great
right.
governor, and
Right.
it's right off of Lincoln Avenue, somewhere north of Fullerton, as
Yeah.
I recall.
And there's also a monument to him and a citation from his speech when he freed the Haymarket guys. And they went after him. They destroyed his career, destroyed his financial life, and he paid a terrible price for having done the right thing. You know, it's a little
Warren,
bit like
we were
Dick
talking
Cheney. Pardon?
when we were talking a couple of weeks back and started
Yeah.
to think about getting together on this.
Yeah.
We were talking beatniks and bohemians, the underground, and
Right. Right.
I started thinking of things like Allen Ginsberg,
Right.
that poem Wichita Vortex Sutra, and
Yeah.
then Ferlinghetti with Coney Island of the Mind,
Which
and
city
then even back to Chicago with the likes of Eddie Belchowski. You know,
Right.
so throw in on some of those people.
Well, Eddie was a guy that I knew well. He's a wonderful artist, and I have some of his work to this day, in fact. But Eddie Belchowski, Sid Harris, Johnny Rawson, these were guys who had gone off and fought with the Lincoln Brigade in the 30s in Spain, and then they came back to the United States and were mostly harassed by the FBI for to the end of their days. But they were termed, that Orwellian term for them was premature anti-fascists, which meant that yes, it was good that they were against Hitler, but they did it too soon. And as a consequence of doing it too soon, of course, the United States had embargoed Spain between 34 and 36, the Spanish Civil War, and that helped cost the Spanish loyalists, who the Lincoln Brigaders fought with, helped cost them the insurgency, and the fascists won.
Yeah, like both Hitler and Mussolini were practicing before the Second World War, before we got involved,
Right,
on
frankly.
Spain, and American progressives went over there to try to keep the current government or protect against fascism.
Right, right.
So Eddie Belchowski was a pretty well-known artist and also a pianist. And I didn't know
and he
anything
had one
about
arm.
him when we
Yeah.
were early days at the Heartland Cafe, where
Yeah.
the show originates from.
Right.
There was a one-armed guy playing the piano at the Heartland in one of the
Right.
dining rooms on an afternoon.
Yeah.
And I remember just kind of walking by and stopping and looking at him. He gave me a really hard little look. But I just smiled and I dug it. And then I talked to Mimi Harris. You mentioned Sid Harris.
Yeah,
Mimi, Sid was a great photographer and had fought in Spain. And Mimi is his wife. She ran the old 3-penny cinema where there were like a lot of hip movies.
She's
And
amazing. Johnny
she
Rawson
filled
owned
me
it.
in on Belchowski. She told me who he was and all that stuff. And I wish I had known more about him early and even talked to him when I
He's
had
an amazing guy.
could have
Amazing.
talked to him.
Yeah, but that's again, Mimi Harris, wonderful, wonderful, amazing woman, wife to Sid, and Sid was a terrific photographer. Eddie, an artist, and had one arm. I saw him in a documentary which had been shot and was being shown in East Germany, of all places, in East Berlin in the early 80s. And lo and behold, I went to see it, and there was Eddie popping up on screen and talked about his experiences in the Spanish Civil War. He lost an arm in the Civil War, and he remained a one-handed piano player of real ability. Just a marvelous, marvelous character.
Warren Leming, you mentioned Germany, and I just flashed that when I first met you was probably the night that you played a Rising Up Angry benefit at Alice's restaurant, or Alice's Revisited.
Right.
And then, you guys were hitting it pretty heavy with Wilderness Road on Columbia Records. And I
Right.
didn't really see or know much about you. Then later on, there's all this German connection. So
Right.
I'm going to ask you, who was around at the time of the Bohemians, how do you connect to Berlin and to Germany?
Well, I went to live in East Berlin, West Berlin, East Berlin. In the early 80s, I was working on some Brecht material, and I wanted to get more language proficiency because I speak German. And off I went, and I wound up living at part of the time in East Berlin. And that was very difficult to get into in those days. You had the wall up, and they were, considered persona non grata by the American government. And lo and behold, when I came back from Berlin, I got a call from the FBI, and they said, would you mind if we came over and interviewed you, or we had a little talk? I think that was the way it was phrased. And I said, no, I don't want you guys coming over where I'm living, but I'll meet you at a restaurant. I remember this guy said, well, how will you know me? And I said, I'll meet you at the Busy Bee restaurant on Damon Avenue in Wicker Park, and believe me, I will know you. So I walk in the Busy Bee that morning, and there's a guy in a white shirt, red tie, blue blazer, khaki pants. And I went up to him and I said, "Hi, Joe, it's Warren. Let's sit down and have a conversation." And we did. And he was interested in my reasons for going. I said I was there just out of curiosity. And in those days, you had to be officially invited normally. And his question to me, quite accurately, was, well, what brought you there? I said I was interested in what was going on. It's a socialist country, so called, and I was interested in how that was working and whatnot. And have you been out of the country? I asked, and he said, no, I've never left. I said, well, you got to get out of the United States to get a real good understanding of what's going on here.
That's still
And
true today for people to get out of the country and to travel
absolutely. And
both in the country and out of the country.
yeah, and I'm one of these people like you. I have spent my entire life looking at the rest of the world from a country on whose side, in terms of the internationally, the liberation movements, I'm never on. In other words, my country, yours included, of course, right, is never on the right side internationally of any kind of liberation movement. So I'm looking at Cuba, and I'm looking at Nicaragua, and I'm looking at El Salvador, and I'm looking at Central and South America, and I'm looking elsewhere, and I don't find the United States on the right side of any of those situations. And that's been going
But
on.
I did report earlier in the show at the opening, there's a new president came into office just last night in Guatemala, and a lot of resistance from the old guard there. And but in one article I read, it really did talk about how the U.S. really kind of paved the way and stood up to the old regime regarding
There was a notorious guy in Guatemala. He's a fundamentalist Christian. His name was General Rios Montt. And we were financing and equipping and training his people. And he was responsible, as was the Guatemalan army, for the deaths of maybe 200,000 indigenous people in Guatemala. So don't think that the Guatemalan Mayan population doesn't know who the United States or what it represents in that situation. He was later tried by their Supreme Court and found guilty of crimes against humanity. I think the court later had to back away because of death threats, but at least they found guilty one time around. But we have a very sad history with Guatemala.
Warren Leming, let me ask you a little bit about the topic was sort of bohemian generation and resistance.
Right.
If I was to ask you, what about that bohemian?
Well, you had mentioned Ginsburg. I went in 1959 as a high school senior. I had gone to see Allen Ginsburg at the Sherman House in Chicago, where he read his poems Kaddish and Howl. And Howl, poetry was taken more seriously in those days. Howl was actually, as I recall, there was a profile done of Ginsburg in Life magazine, and they had reprinted the entirety of Howl. And like a lot of Americans of our age in 1957, I read On the Road, and that was a mind blower. Everybody read On the Road. There wasn't anybody who didn't read that book and who wasn't affected by it. And it is an extraordinary book. And it turns heads around.
I read it too. And
Yeah, exactly.
I actually was in Mexico in the hospital in 62 when I read it. And then I was writing my own notes. And I remember giving them to a Panamanian nurse who spoke English. She asked if she could read, and she brought it back to me and never came back as I was recounting my adventures, probably with the influence of On the Road.
Well, what did she run off with your note?
I had an Olivetti typewriter that I brought with me to Mexico on my motorcycle, and was typing up my
Amazing.
trip and my story and my experiences.
Yeah, you're on the road.
Some of them which were a little wild for a young guy.
Yeah.
So that was that. So that was my biggest memory of On the Road is what.
Well, you were on your motorcycle also and knocking around, and all of us in some sense or other, I think, attempted to go on the road. That was the impact of that book was, look, you're free. And the beatnik ideology, if they could be said to have had one, was experience. Go out and live, go out and work, go out and meet the people, go out and do what you can. And I think you made that work.
Where do you think things are at today?
I wish we could go back 20, 30 years and reignite what happened with Rising Up Angry, what happened with The Road, what happened with that whole generation of people who were pro-civil rights and against the war. And because we're in a very, very awful spot, terrible spot now when you look at the Trump situation. And it seems to have produced, at least in Iowa, places like it, a kind of mom and pop fascism. And that's spooky to consider, But if you think of the Midwest, I think, always of that American Gothic, the guy with the pitchfork next to his wife and whatnot. But I might have to add a swastika flag to that, which is pretty bleak result, I would say. And we're in a tough spot now, and it's difficult.
But Warren, don't you see any positive things going on?
I do. Yeah, no, I do see. I mean,
I think things were always kind of rough, don't you? I mean, we always had.
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah, I would agree with you. But there are elements within the Democratic Party that are progressive. And say what you will about Joe Biden. Joe Biden, I think, is at least economically has done a good job. And if I look at the Trump legacy, which is basically what we're talking about, this was a guy who assumed the American presidency. Remember, he lost the election. This is a guy who lost by 3 million votes, and because of this fakakta meshugana, College of Cardinals, this electoral college, he becomes president of the United States, and he basically uses the presidency as an ATM to enrich himself. There's a new report that has just been issued by the U.S. Congress, not a small, uninvolved body exactly, detailing the millions that Trump came away with. This is the first and only instance of a president essentially turning the office, into his ATM. And that's what Trump did. And we're talking about millions upon millions of dollars from the Chinese, from the Russians, from whomever was renting his hotel rooms, etc. The son-in-law gets $2 billion from the Saudis. I mean, this is unheard of, unexplained, and incomprehensible that somebody like that.
Well, what do you think? We're two old guys here.
Yeah.
What do you think your role is? My role. What do you think the role of older people ought to be at this time? But
well, I mean, I think it's what we're doing. You get out there and make some noise. Get out there and fight the good fight, because we got our backs to the wall in some sense or other. And we're hoping that the people will step up and step to the mark, because we got to do something about this guy and what he represents. You and I know that there's always been a fascist component to this country. And here's somebody who represents it overtly, not covertly, overtly. He's openly using the old fascist rhetoric. Okay. And I'm saying that everybody's got to step up in whatever way they can. If it's making skateboards and putting anti-Trump slogans on them, do it. But everybody's got to step up at this point and do whatever they can. That means making their voices public. We got to do this.
What do you think would be the role of performers and artists these days?
I think they ought to take their lessons from somebody like Brecht and not from David Mamet, who's a Trumper. Okay, and Mamet's a Trump guy, and I'm saying look to Brecht in terms of doing some political theater, whatever. Do some cabaret, and look for venues where that's possible, because it's simply a matter of survival at this point.
Warren, talk a little bit about Brecht and what attracted you to Brecht and what you like about Brecht.
He's the major playwright of the 20th century. Unfortunately, as they say at the State Department, he was a communist. Okay, a very committed communist. And I've looked into his work seriously, and he's a great poet. And he was a wonderful writer, did some marvelous theater. I think he did 40 plays. He was a great director, a great theater person. As you make your bed, so you will lie in it, and no one to pull you through. And if someone's doing the kicking, that would be me. And someone's going to get kicked, that would be you. Okay. So this is a little taste of Brecht. And he's just simply the guy you're going to take on 20th century theater or 21st century theater. You can't go around them. You got to go through them. You got to learn your stuff. We don't do that stuff well in this country. Okay. We do Tennessee Williams. Okay. He's a native, but we don't do Brecht well. There's a production coming up at a little theater in Chicago of Mother Courage, which I urge everybody to check their papers, check New City or whatever, and go out and see. My friend Hugh Iglarsh over at New City is going to be reviewing it, but it's Brecht's masterpiece, and I urge everybody to see it. I think it's the Trapdoor Theater who were doing it, if I'm correct in that. So, try to see it. It's a masterwork. And it's also tendentious stuff.
Warren Leming, can I ask you, are you still writing plays?
I do a weekly Facebook poetry thing, and I write anti-Trump, anti-regime poems for Facebook under my own name. And we're working on a review. They're also working on a book, which I got to get around to getting together. I got to get it edited, and I'd like to get that out there too. And people support Kerr Publishing under the wonderful aegis of Tamara Smith, who's a wonderful activist, organizer. Michael, you know her. I know her. She's a marvelous gal. She's in Mexico City part of the time. But she is doing great work at Kerr Publishing, which is, by the way, the oldest left publisher in the United States. Now, I know a lot of this stuff sounds like nostalgia to people, but it's not. It's still an active part of a great Chicago tradition, of which Rising Up Angry and Mike James and Wilderness Road and all these other folks are part of. Okay, Chicago was a very, very left town, and it remains in part, still like that. And I urge everybody to get out there and make some noise, bang on, your silverware, etc.
Well, people, we're recording this in the midst of a really cold spell here,
Right.
And so no one's running around outside. But I think that Chicago is in a lot of ways in a good place. We've always had challenges. We have current ones coming up with
Right.
the number of immigrants coming here. But
Right.
there are, we got a more progressive city council. We have a much better mayor than.
I think there are 5 socialists on the city council. There are 5 guys who identify as socialists, which is unheard of. I mean, this is the city of, of Daley, going back to the '68 convention in which both you and I played a part. We were there in '68. We're 68ers, we were there for that,
Well, Warren Leming, it's been fun talking to you. And I know we rambled around a lot, but we certainly touched on some things, and we probably can get some good quotes out of it. I'm going to, while I still have you here, I'm going to just let people know that on our recent shows, we had some real interesting guests. And I'm just going to tell you who they are, you can get them all at youtube.com/heartlandmedia/videos. We had Jeff Smith talking about Evanston and the new stadium up there and many other things. We had Jim Canadle talking about his new book. We had Bob Lawson and Steve Goldsmith talking about labor. We had David Dorado Romo talking about the devil's rope and barbed wire on the border. And we had the incomparable Don Rose and Chuy Garcia on. All of those are available. And we've got Kathy Kelly, Thorne Dreyer from the Rag blog out of Austin, Texas, Bill Knight from downstate Illinois, the poet Grady Chambers. We got Peg Dublin coming on talking about some activities for older people. So we're glad you've been tuning in to the Live from the Heartland show, however you've gotten it. Remember, just because someone's grumpy about life and money doesn't mean they have to help vote in a fascist. So spread the word. I want to thank the people who made the show possible. That would be our engineer, Hal James, our producers, Katie Hogan, Tom Clark, and Lynn Orman, our guests, Dick Simpson and Warren Leming. And we'll be back next week. Do good in the world, because the world needs all the good that you do, that I do, that we do together. All power to the people.